Big ones. Huh. Maybe I could slip around past them.
Howdy howdy everybody. Today I'm covering Evil West, a third-person action/shooter developed by Flying Wild Hog, the Polish company that brought us the Shadow Warrior reboots. It released in November 2022, and it's a strange beast. Its combat system is loosely styled after Devil May Cry, but to me it felt like someone shuffled up the design documents of Gears of War and God of War. It's weighted a bit more towards brawler than shooter, and there's no cover system here, but something about the dialogue, story, and overall gameplay really screams 2006 throwback. Maybe it's the character designs. Everyone looks like an action figure. We play as Jesse Rentier, a field agent for the Rentier Institute, the United States' premier line of defense against vampires and other monsters, which is somewhat inexplicably a small family business that the Rentiers must always control, but is also funded fully through the Department of Defense and has an amorphous amount of employees. We're dropped right into the action on the trail of a powerful vampire, and from there it explodes into an all-out war between humanity and vampires, or as they're called in this setting, the sanguisuge, or ticks in the vernacular. The setting is both oddly grounded and out there. It's a narrow line to dance across. President Grover Cleveland makes an appearance, and so does the corpse of a pre-Columbian Godzilla. Other than the 22nd or perhaps 24th President of the United States, there isn't really anything else grounding this story as an alternate history. Let's dig into the basics of the lore first, because there are some clever bits baked into the background here. Most vampire stories style their vampires around bats, and to an extent, so does Evil West. The highborn vampires that you'll frequently face as sub-bosses are indeed batty, but it adds a nice twist from there. The majority of the enemies we encounter in the game are essentially vampires who have degenerated into mindless chaff, or former humans mutated by the vampire's experiments. See, in Evil West, the vampires utilize a lot of mind-controlled or simply willing humans to do their day-to-day deeds. The primary villain of the story has found a way to mix their vampiric blood with the blood from several ancient mythical creatures, and use it to mutate their familiars into more powerful but more feral creatures. To facilitate this, the vampires need to transport large amounts of blood across the US. And that's where the leeches come in.
Christ, it's a goddamn blood factory.
A lot of the enemies are styled around leeches. Huge mutated hulks weighed down by the massive leeches hanging from their heads, or thin, failed experiments riddled with parasites, seemingly a moment away from being sucked dry. I do really like this pivot away from the typical vampire lore to allow for some more freshwater enemies. There's also a lot of very cool decisions laid out immediately in the lore here that allow for memorable set pieces. For example, the highborn vampires don't play by the normal rules of death, so the Institute takes their heads and keeps them in a prison, a hall of jars, for later interrogation. This game is definitely a case where the written world and graphic design choices combine to make some very memorable backdrops. The actual dialogue and story writing is, well, it works. It does not have anything like the originality or effort at period accuracy of a game like Red Dead, and that's fine. This is a much goofier game than Red Dead Redemption after all. But there isn't much care paid to the realism of the setting, and the plotline is pretty immediately predictable. We're joined by a cast of characters who never really become interesting. It's a crew of sidekicks who know they're sidekicks. There's not too much in the way of memorable dialogue, and all of the characters turn out to be exactly who you think they are on first sight. On the bright side, you can tell some of the voice actors were really having a lot of fun with their lines.
Yes, quite. Well, as I say, keep up the good work. God bless you all, and God bless America.
Visual design is probably the high point of Evil West. This is a shockingly pretty game. If you've ever played a Western game, a lot of these environments will feel familiar, and it might make you mad that this is the first time they've looked this good. Take the canyon level, pretty typical red rock sand, and what's this? We're actually halfway up a mesa, and sweeping down before us is a plain, and in the distance, mountains like blunted teeth. As we advance, the red rock gives way to a verdant riverside winding through the canyon. There's such an excellent use of color. You'll enter an arena that contrasts with the level's larger theme, but it works. It's like a Western movie remembered through a fever. I honestly can't praise the background design enough. These levels constantly made me stop in my tracks to gawk at the scenery. It's a game that knows a shadow can be purple. We're also dealing with a really gnarly cast of enemies in this game. Most are pretty readable at a glance, but towards the end of the game, when they start throwing lots of mini-bosses into small arenas together, readability can break down. My biggest complaint with the graphical design of the game is the main character's outfit. It's half Warhammer, half Western, which is alright, but he's just got too much stuff on him. Like a kid on Christmas morning carrying every toy he owns. And since he's at the forefront, we spend quite a bit of time staring at a cluttered silhouette. Beyond the terrific visuals, there are a few shortcomings. The cutscenes are nice, but there aren't any facial animations in-engine. And as good as it looks, it becomes very jarring when a combat animation gets an enemy stuck in a tree or the sky. They're the type of little graphical glitches that gamers are so familiar with they might not even register them. Hair and fabric in particular are pretty rough to look at, and it does seem like some animations are identical to the 2018 God of War. One noticeable downside is a lack of interactivity between your weapons and the environment. It's been a while since I've played a game that has a flamethrower as a weapon, but almost nothing flammable in the world. It's a bit jarring when you're dropped into the spider caves and your instinct to kill them all with fire does absolutely nothing. This game sounds crisp. Enemies have a distinct call-out siren used specifically to telegraph their attacks, and even the more chaotic brawls are mixed well enough that the player can hear an unseen enemy rearing up for a big attack. There isn't a tremendous amount of music used in-game, but I generally label it as folk but evil. Maybe we'll call it bleak grass.
That felt good.
There wasn't much in the sound to make the heart race, but it did feel well-paced and never grew too dissonant or muddy, even during some of the more elaborate arenas. Evil West is really a relic of a bygone gameplay design philosophy. It's a third-person shooter, but combat encourages up-close and personal punching a little more than shooting. On the higher difficulty, it's pretty hard to do enough range damage to kill anything outright. The most dated aspect is level design. This is essentially a corridor shooter. There are 16 levels, each taking between 10 minutes and an hour, difficulty depending. Each level is functionally the same. We walk down a narrow path through a seemingly very open space that is actually bounded by invisible walls. Eventually we are dumped into an arena where we kill a bucket full of enemies, and then we repeat. Sometimes the path diverges slightly so we can snatch a hidden collectible, but this is a game with an incredibly linear advancement path. Up until the 10th level, the encounter design is very engaging. You'll fight swarms of weak enemies, then deal with a new mini-boss or a final boss. These first encounters are challenging but exciting, and since you haven't unlocked the full arsenal yet, they can last quite a while, and generally felt like very earned victories. Around the 10th level, once all abilities are unlocked and all mini-bosses have been seen, the game starts packing you into tighter arenas and doubling up mini-bosses in new combinations. I believe the max you fight is 5 mini-bosses simultaneously. These late-game fights started to feel like a slog. There are narrow interruption windows, and frequently the mini-bosses will trigger their abilities almost simultaneously, while seemingly infinite waves of chaff enemies swarm in. The intent, I believe, is to use the smaller enemies to refill your health and special attack meter, Doom Eternal style. But the fights don't play quite as smoothly as Doom Eternal, so at times it breaks down. What tended to happen for me is that I would rush out all my abilities at once to burst down whichever of the mini-bosses was the most annoying. and then spend the rest of the fight dodging an unending barrage of shockwave attacks while I wait for the cooldowns to return. Towards the end, I really missed the introduction of new enemies. We've got a lot of tools at our disposal, and at times it becomes hard to remember them all. Our bread and butter is the Power Glove. It has a single combo attack, and it's only operated using a single button, so not very complicated. Taps for quick attacks, hold for a launching uppercut, which opens an enemy up for other options, mostly input through the joystick. There's a Dark Souls dodge roll, and we've also got an electric zapper that allows us to teleport to enemies, pull them over to us, and finish out combos. But it also acts as our parry, and successful parries stun an enemy. Stunned enemies are open to a special combo that deals extra damage, but again, this is done by smashing the R1 button, just like everything else. Gunplay is fairly limited. We can switch on the fly between a precision rifle and a fast-firing crossbow, with a loosely aimed revolver that can be used without entering shooting stance. Beyond the basics, we've got a bunch of cooldown abilities. An AoE stun, a flamethrower, a health pack, a shotgun, a Gatling gun, and dynamite. They recharge either based on time or damage done. Towards the end of the game, the combat really degrades into pure cooldown management. Our energy meter is used mostly for activating an ultimate melee attack, but with perks we can also use the energy meter to heal or deal out additional AoE attacks. Although we've got a cheap buffet of options, the controls were rarely confusing, and I almost never miskeyed actions in my playthroughs. That does bring me to my biggest problem with the game. Every encounter is functionally the same, all the enemies behave fairly identically, and there isn't really the possibility of experimentation in combat. There are a lot of options, but there isn't really any impact in how they're used. Just like the Melee, it's a game that seems designed around hitting the same button over and over with no regard for timing or experimentation. We've also got some light RPG elements here that are somewhat unnecessary. There are almost no skippable enemies, and it's impossible to grind additional enemies, so the experience-based perk tree feels out of place. Perks don't massively change the way you play, they mostly just improve existing combat skills. We can also upgrade our weapons using the collectible bucks found throughout the levels, and these are also generally straight improvements with no downsides or real considerations necessary. I did encounter a few odd bugs in Evil West, mostly pathing breakage when multiple sub-bosses appeared simultaneously, but there was a consistent issue I had every few missions where the aiming became dislodged from the crosshair. I could fix it with a restart, but it was strange how often it recurred. There was also a collectible that inexplicably had its path fully blocked by a terrain element, until I backtracked a moment and then returned. I'm not sure if that was intentional. Overall, not a tremendous amount of bugs, but they are worth mentioning. I enjoyed parts of Evil West. It's got modern graphics but a retro heart, and that throwback of core game mechanics has a much larger impact on me than a simple 8-bit veneer. It's a corridor shooter with great visual design and temporarily addictive combat. On the other hand, there's clunkiness in parts. Encounter design becomes repetitive by the midpoint, and the fights have a tendency to sprawl into chaotic messes towards the end. It's a real mixed bag, and by the end I found myself wishing it had taken more big swings at originality. As is, it felt like a game I've played many times before on the Xbox 360. On the pain scale, I'd give this one a moderate. If you're itching for a simplified Devil May Cry or God of War, and don't particularly care about the storytelling aspects of those games, you'd likely get a bigger kick out of this one than I did. But I'd find it hard to recommend this game over any of the classics it's imitating. Unfortunately, it's the kind of game that made me think about other games during the runtime. I really should replay Odyssey to the West someday, see if it's as good as I remember. Anyways, that's my 9th review, and my 2nd review with West in the title. If you'd like to support my channel, a like, comment, or subscribe does in fact go a long way. Thanks. See you!